when I finally got sober, it wasn't any great, huge revelation or huge rock bottom or something awful happened. And I was like, oh my God, I got to quit, because that happened to me over and over again. I mean, if you talk to enough people who've gone through, recovery or who are in recovery, I mean, they'll say, you'll just hear over and over that there's just this moment of clarity where something clicks. And I was just waiting for that moment of clarity, and I didn't know if it was ever going to come. I didn't know if I was going to die, but it did come, and I can't explain why it came when it did, but it just did.
Hello and welcome to Health and Humanity with Dan Voss, a new podcast show centered around improving our health and our human connection and relationships. I have with me here today Erica C. Barnett, and she is the publisher and editor of The C is for Crank, a website focused on Seattle politics and policy, and a freelance journalist writing about homelessness, transportation, housing, and urban issues. Erica is also the author of her new book, Quitter, a Memoir of Drinking, Relapse, and Recovery, which is a startlingly frank memoir of one woman's struggles with alcoholism and recovery, with essential new insights into addiction and treatment. The book is to be released on July 7th. Erica, how's it going?
Good. How's it going with you?
It's going really well.
We're
I can't
in
complain.
month 20 of quarantine, it feels like.
Right. I know. I was actually talking to somebody the other day about a trip we had in January, just 5 months ago. And it felt like it was like a year ago.
Yeah. It's I don't know when we're going to get out of this. Obviously, my whole book tour and plan is out the window. And I'm doing this. So, but it's good. It's all good.
So let's talk about your new book here, Quitter. And I want to talk, obviously you go into the idea of overcoming obstacles and rebuilding your life from scratch to the extent of what you're comfortable with sharing. What kind of obstacles did you have to overcome, and what did you learn in the process?
Well, my book is about relapse primarily and alcoholism. So I would say the primary obstacle that I had to overcome was, obviously my addiction, but the sort of related obstacle was that I kept relapsing and feeling, because of everything that I had learned in treatment and, just from various things I had done to try to quit drinking, I felt that relapse was failure. And I felt that if I didn't succeed right away, or if I kept failing, that was the end of my story. And so for me, I think what ultimately, it's very hard to say what ultimately gets anybody clean or anybody to be able to stop doing whatever it is that's self-destructive to them. But for me, it really was realizing that I wasn't failing, I was learning.
Sure.
And so I think a lot of the obstacles that you have to overcome with addiction in particular are internal. And I mean, it is a brain disease, but it is also a mental disorder. And so, every time I relapsed, I learned something else about, how to get better, what was going to get me out of this, what didn't work. So I would say my biggest obstacles were inside myself.
Wow. Yeah, and I think that's something that can really be applied to not just recovery and addiction, in terms of you have those moments where you fail and your first thought is, I'm failing, right? Like, this is a failure, but it's really not. It's something that you can get back up and just try again. And I think you can apply that to other areas in life. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I learned after I got sober was that, so I had lost my job. Part of my journey was I got fired from a job that I really loved and that I worked my entire life toward. And it was the only time I'd ever been fired from anything. And the concept was like not even in my vocabulary of losing a job that wasn't my own volition. And so I thought that was like the biggest failure that could ever happen to me as a person. I was very, very hard on myself. And I was unemployed for a while, which in a way, I mean, even at the time, I sort of recognized it as a blessing, even though I was still in that pit of drinking myself to death and, just alcoholic, suicidal, horrible,
Sure.
depths that you go to. But it gave me a little space and it gave me a little time. And when I quit drinking, I was still unemployed for a while and I got a job and and it was a job where I could sort of, again, have that space to think about what came next.
Sure.
And so I think that the lesson that I learned through that experience was you can really do whatever you want with your life within reason, and I had never felt like I felt like I had a straight path from the time I was a little girl. I always wanted to be a journalist along the way. And addiction was just, was something that I never anticipated as a barrier. And so when I came out of that, I realized that I had set that obstacle up of thinking that, my life had to go in this straight trajectory. And it enabled me, I mean, weirdly, being unemployed and working a job that wasn't really what I wanted to do long term, enabled me to say, you know what, I can do whatever I want. And so I started my own business. I started doing a website as a journalist by myself, which is very, some might say pretty risky. But it might not have worked. It happened to be the case that it has worked and it's worked out great. But if it hadn't, it wouldn't have been the end of the world,
Sure.
So I guess one of the lessons I learned is also to ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? And usually it's not as bad as you were sort of catastrophizing that it might be.
Do you think by asking that question, what's the worst that can happen, do you feel like that instilled in you a level of self-confidence to the point where, you went through, you're facing obstacles like addiction, but knowing that you can overcome that? Do you feel like that brought you a new sense of self-confidence to go off and now start a business and let your career take off? Is there some correlation there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, addiction almost killed me. And I think that is the worst that can happen. And that's pretty bad. And so coming out of that, and again, like I say in my book, I mean, I have relapsed a lot. I have more than 5 years sober now, which is a trend I would like to keep continuing.
Yeah,
but
that's great.
relapse does happen to people.
Sure.
And that's not the worst that can happen. So for me, I mean, yeah, the worst that could happen in starting my own business, and I'm a Patreon supported business, and it was fairly new when I started out asking for support about 5 years ago. And the worst that could happen is nobody wants the product that I'm selling, which is my work. And so then I go on and do something else. I mean, I've worked retail. I've done all kinds of jobs to support my ability to do journalism over the years. And I don't think there's any shame in any other kind of job either. And so if that's the worst that could happen for me, or if the worst that can happen is I have to go get a job in journalism that, that I may be overqualified for, or that isn't where I want to live, or whatever it may be, that's not that bad either.
Right.
So, and the best that can happen is really great. And I feel like I have, in some ways lucked into a best case scenario where people pay me for this work and are really generous with paying me for this work. But I certainly didn't have the confidence that that would happen. I just had the confidence that whatever happened, I would be fine.
Yeah. I think that's such a powerful question to ask yourself. What is the worst that can happen? Obviously, with something like addiction, like you said, the worst thing that could happen is that it would kill you. But for people that are taking new adventures and taking that leap, whether it's in business or just some sort of big transition in life, I think it's such a powerful question to ask yourself, what is the worst that can happen? And it allows you to go into a space where you see yourself succeeding, I think, that much easier.
Yeah, and I didn't invent that question. I actually learned
Sure.
it from cognitive behavioral therapy, which sort of teaches you, because one of my tendencies is to catastrophize and to think that everything is going to end up horrible. I mean, when I was in the midst of my addiction, and even now, I mean, my tendency is to think, oh my God, I'm going to end up homeless. That's where I go. Which is like frankly, at this point, a ridiculous thing for me to be thinking. But, that is where my brain goes. And so cognitive behavioral techniques tell you to ask yourself, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Okay, what then? Okay, what then? With any situation in your life. And if you're putting that worst case scenario literally on paper and asking yourself, so what would I do then? Okay, so then the worst happens. What would I do then? It starts to feel more manageable, and you also start to recognize when some of your worst case scenarios are not really very realistic for your
Sure.
current situation.
Yeah. I remember asking that question to myself when I started my business, and I had a full-time job, started the business, and then my goal was to take the business full-time, which I did 3 years ago. And no, I'm sorry, I did that a little over a year ago, but the business started 3 years ago. But I remember when I was in that phase of working the full-time job and also starting a side business, that my first question was, well, what's the worst that can happen if I quit my job and I can no longer, if something happens with a business where I can no longer pay my bills and the business doesn't succeed, what is the worst that could happen? And for me, it was that I would have to move back in with my parents, which I'm very lucky to have parents that are supportive and would take me back in if I got to that point. And that's when I was like, okay, I can do this. I'm at a spot where I can actually take that leap and quit my job and go full time with the business. So I just think it's a really powerful question to have.
Yeah, and same thing. I mean, I'm very privileged and lucky because I also have parents that are very supportive and
Yeah.
have always said if you have to move back in, you can. Now I am at a point in my pride, just because I'm 42 years old, that would be a big pride hit for me at this point.
Sure.
But at the same time, like that is the bottom that I would most likely fall to in my living situation, and it's not that bad. It's so much better than a lot of people, probably the majority of people. So yeah, it's also an opportunity to kind of count your blessings.
Yeah, and that's actually another great point. That's another reminder I like to give myself, is that no matter how tough life gets, no matter what obstacles throw my way, whatever situation I'm in, there's always somebody else out there that has it worse. And not that it makes it any easier to compare yourself to other people, but knowing that there are people out there that they have it worse than you in some way, so it just puts things into perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of touch on the idea of self-confidence. What level of faith did you have to put into yourself? If we can maybe start with the idea of struggling with addiction and in that recovery phase, what type of faith did you have to have in yourself? And then as well as the business side in your career, what faith did you have to put into yourself?
Well, the thing about recovery, for me anyway, is that it's not something you can do alone. And so it did require a leap of faith, but it was a faith that was kind of based on seeing that other people who were in worse circumstances than me were able to do it. And so I talk in the book about, I started going to AA meetings, which is something I absolutely resisted for years and years. And, and I don't think it is a necessary step for everybody, but for me, it really helped. And
Sure.
One of the reasons it helped is because I was seeing so many people who, like, it just made me feel like, I don't know if you can swear on this podcast, but
yeah, I can.
But a real a-hole, let's say that. So I sort of realized, like, I have all the privilege and luck in the world, and other people don't, and other people are able to recover. So you know what? I can too. And it wasn't even I should be able to, like I was ashamed. It was like just a confidence that other people have gone through this process and I can do it too if they can.
Yeah.
So that was recovery. It wasn't really confidence in myself. It was confidence in the process that I was going through, that it had worked for other people.
Knowing that it was attainable.
Yeah. I mean, it was clearly attainable. And, when I first started going to those meetings, I really thought, like, this is just not something that applies to me, and it's not something that is possible. But I stuck around and I kept listening to people. And that's really all it was listening to other people and realizing that they didn't do it alone either. And they were able to get there. So that's one thing. And with business, I mean, and with journalism, I work by myself, and I that is an area where I do have quite a lot of confidence in myself, I will say. I mean, it's mostly confidence born of the fact that I've been messing up and doing it for 20 years now. Um, it's not the confidence that you should have when you jump into something and you have no idea what you're doing.
Right.
But I also, again, like, it's not even that I had confidence that I would succeed. I had confidence I would be fine, even if I didn't succeed at the particular goal I was shooting for. Because I tried lots of things. I mean, I'm a terrible baker, and I've gotten better in quarantine. I mean, you're not good at everything, and you're not going to succeed at everything. But there is a certain amount of confidence you need just to try and to realize that you'll be okay if it doesn't work out.
Yeah. Wow. On the topic of recovery, you talk about a big piece that for you to have confidence and realize that you can do this was by talking to other people and hearing their stories and realizing that so many other people were able to achieve this, so that you could as well. Mm-hmm. The idea there, I think, is that we as humans, we like to reciprocate things. We see things and then you want to do that as well, right? Like you see somebody else succeeding, you see them going down this path, good or bad, and it kind of makes you want to follow. Do you think there's any correlation there with the topic of, let's say, alcoholism? I see I feel like there's just so much propaganda. There's so much advertising. It's almost like, in a way, a brainwashing. Our whole lives of growing up, you hear about, drinking is fun, drinking is cool, it's going to make you feel good. All of these things that we're told, that in my opinion, makes people want to drink and then fall into that trap. Is there a correlation between the two?
I mean, I absolutely agree with you that there is a tremendous amount of propaganda in favor of drinking. So, for instance, I mean, when I was first getting sober, one of the things I did as an exercise every day was just write down every single time I encountered something that, really not even something that reminded me of alcohol, but just alcohol, just like an ad for alcohol, or you're like not even in the wine aisle, but there's like an end cap of, whatever the summer like seltzer is or whatever.
Right.
Or billboards, or just everywhere. So I think we are absolutely bombarded with messages from a very young age that this is a safe and fun substance to consume. And, I would say, I mean, it's not healthy for anybody, honestly. It's just not a healthy thing to consume, but we all consume things that aren't healthy. I consume chocolate and,
Sure.
And like I said, I bake a lot. So it's, it's everything in moderation for most people, but it definitely does send a message just culturally that, that it's okay. And also that if you have quote unquote a problem, that it is your problem. And there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to the idea that you can't handle something that everybody else can handle. And that was really hard. And I think is really hard for a lot of people who want to get into recovery to overcome that shame and stigma, because, everybody, I mean, I thought I could drink like the guys, or I could drink like one of the girls, or,
Right.
it was always like somebody else.
Up. Yeah.
And it was really hard to get into my head the notion that I couldn't, because that just doesn't exist culturally. We don't have a lot of models for that, particularly for women.
Right. Wow. That's I appreciate you sharing that. And I know people that are struggling with alcoholism or on the path to recovery, I think it's super powerful for them to hear that from you. What are some practical steps that you have taken in order to get to where you are? And I know that's a broad question, but if you can walk us through some practical steps that you took along the way.
Well, I would say the biggest thing that we haven't talked about that was really, really tremendous for me was getting my financial house in order. I was $30-something thousand in debt, most of it medical and from credit cards. And I just looked at that mountain of debt and I felt like there's no way I can ever get out from under that, because when you're making, I think when I got my first job, it was like $40,000 a year. I live in Seattle. It's a very expensive city, and that's not a lot of money. And so I really adopted an attitude of frugality. And I also just kind of went through, my dad is always trying to inculcate me with this Dave Ramsey idea of like, eat rice and beans and just pay off. I don't even know what the Dave Ramsey system is because I certainly didn't do it. But I sort of adopted my own idea of that, which is that I just started calling all the credit card companies and all the hospitals and all the debt collection agencies. And I just said, look, I want to work with you. Let me know like how we can get on a plan. And a lot of them actually did reduce my debts, which I was really surprised by. Wow. Some didn't, but I felt like I was taking action, and even just action, even if you can't pay it off, feels like a little bit of control.
Right.
And so once I started realizing that like I could actually control some of this. And my method was actually just to pay off an entire debt and then move on to the next one. I mean, I don't know if that's like a sound financial strategy, but it was a sound mental strategy for me. Sure. Because I felt like I was achieving something.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, and I just didn't spend money except on the things that I absolutely had to, rent and food and utilities. And I ended up getting out of debt, I want to say, within 2 years.
Wow. That's awesome.
And I would not have thought that was possible. I mean, that was another thing that I just didn't think was an option for me. I thought I'd die in debt.
Sure.
And so for me, like, and I don't know what other people's like big obstacle is mentally, but for me, that debt was just a crushing load mentally that was keeping me from being able to move on to do other things with my life. I mean, including like I used to travel before all this quite a lot. I never did that before because I had, I just didn't have the money because I had all this debt, and now I'm able to do that. So
it's one less thing you have to worry about, right? It's one less cloud that's hovering over your head.
Yeah. And it's not that everybody is necessarily worried about debt in particular. That was just kind of my like big mental block where I thought I can't do anything else until I deal with this stupid debt. And then I dealt with it, and it just, man, I mean, my mental state, once I paid off that last like credit card bill, I think it was just so improved.
Such a good feeling, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah. I
mean, again, like I'm 42. I think I paid off my debt when I was 39. So I did not learn this lesson very early in life.
Sure.
But I did eventually learn it.
Yeah. Well, you're not alone. You're not the only person that's in debt or credit card debt. And I know a lot of Americans face that reality. And for the record, actually, your approach there was part of the Dave Ramsey approach.
Really?
Yeah. So
oh, my dad will be so happy.
I followed his approach loosely when I was getting out of some credit card debt. But his approach is he calls it the snowball effect, I believe. And basically, you pay off your smallest debt. So whatever that is, a credit card that's like,
oh, wait a second, this is exactly what I did.
Yeah. So it's
so I think it got in my brain.
Yeah, there you go. So
and then you move on to the next one.
So let's say it's like a credit card that's like $300. You pay that off, however long it takes you, and then you spend whatever you would have normally spent paying down that $300. You now put that towards your $700 tab or your bill. And then you put that, it's a snowball, so you can just keep accumulating more and more to the point where you can pay off your largest debt. So
that's basically
sounds like
what
you
I
were
did.
on the right track there. Interesting stuff. So what other practical steps have you taken that kind of put you into that right mindset? Maybe it's little wins, maybe it's big wins. What are some other things that you want to touch on?
Well, one other thing I did in terms of starting functional business is I picked a model which is pretty basic. I am not a subscription-based model in the sense that I don't put a paywall on my work, and I don't have advertisements. I just decided to go for a model where I directly ask people, "Is this worth your money? And if so, like, can you give me $5 a month? Can you give me $10 a month?" And so, but that model, what the practical part of that that's a little more widely applicable is that I learned to ask people for help. And that is something that I found very humbling, because I'd always had jobs and I'd always just gotten a paycheck like everybody else. And in a way, like I was there with my hand out saying, if this is of value, like, please give me money. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's not natural to me to, number one, be sort of selling myself as a product, but
Sure.
number two, just be saying, look, I'm not giving you anything extra for this. My website is free. You can have it for free if you want. But it will continue to exist if you pay me.
Right.
So I think asking other people for help is a really, really important practical skill that everybody can use. It's in some aspect of their life, whether it's dealing with addiction, whether it's dealing with financial circumstances that are beyond your control. Especially now, I mean, with COVID-19, just absolutely upending the economy, tons of people I know are suffering so badly. But I think it goes beyond that, and just learning to say, I don't know how to do this. Can you teach me? Is something that I didn't know how to do, and I'm still learning how to do.
Yeah.
And I think it's just such an important skill.
It's tough, right? It's difficult in many ways to be able to surrender and say, I need help, but also having the confidence knowing that what you are offering, in your case, what you're offering with your website, like you said, you are providing value. So it's not like you're just asking for money for nothing. Like, you're actually giving value, knowing that whoever is going to be receiving that can use that in their life and apply it to good things.
One of the other things that I learned is that I'm not ever going to be good at everything. And if there's a skill that I don't have, I can just ask someone else to do it for me, or pay somebody else to do it for me.
Yeah.
So, I asked a friend who designs websites to make my website not look like crap, because I didn't know how to do it. And ultimately, like, would I like to know how to do that? Of course. But I would also like to know how to speak Spanish fluently. And like, I just don't have the time right now to invest in every single thing I would like to know how to do.
I think
that's another example of asking for help.
I think that's such an important thing that most people don't take the time to really think about it. And I think culturally, like, it's at least in the business culture, it has been ingrained into us to, like, you got to look at your weaknesses and fix them. And I don't think that's the case. I think if you're not good at something, like you said, you're not that good at web design or web development, you can pay somebody to do that. And then you can focus on areas that you are good at and double down on that. So I just find that to be a really interesting idea.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, I'm a sole proprietor, and right now I'm struggling with whether I want to hire an intern. And it's not a financial issue. It's just that I'm like, but I could do it better.
Right.
And that's really hard.
That is tough.
To sort of to think like, yeah, but like, you'd be training somebody and teaching them things, and
Sure.
And all of the reasons that you do something like that. But I'm also in business for myself, in part because I'm just one of those people who's like, but I could do it better.
Right.
Even when that isn't necessarily true. Like, would I do things better if I had two other people here? Absolutely. So that is like a constant struggle, is just thinking I should do everything myself.
Yeah, and that is tough. And the intern example, that's also difficult because it is hard to find good talent. And that's where it's easy to be like, well, I can do this myself and probably do it a little bit better. So that's a tricky situation. In terms of sacrifice, and I kind of want to go back to the topic of recovery. In terms of things that you had to give up, obviously you give up alcohol when you are going through recovery. What other things did you learn that you had to give up?
I'm struggling a little bit with that question, because I don't feel like most of the things I gave up were bad things. So
Okay.
I gave up some friends who were toxic for me. I didn't give up going to bars. I still go to bars. I was one of those alcoholics who drinks at home. And so ultimately, like, I did move away from the place where I was living at the time that I got sober, but ultimately it's like I can't avoid my home. So, what did I give up? I mean, hangovers, you feeling miserable. I mean, for me, like in my recovery, everything just got to such a dark place that I didn't have much. And so there wasn't a lot to give up. And initially, I mean, in a very literal sense, I gave up things like happy hours, and I gave up,
Sure.
let's go out for drinks. And I gave up certain friends who only socialize in that context. But eventually, what you realize in recovery is you can function like a normal human being in most contexts, or at least I can. It's one of the tenets of AA that, you can go wherever a normal person can go as long as you have a reason to be there. And I think that's one of the dumb cliches that I think has been really, really true for me. So I didn't end up giving up going to bars. I didn't end up giving up most of my friends, because most of my friends were thrilled to see me recover. I mean, they were so sick of me.
Yeah.
So it's a hard question to answer, because I don't feel like I sacrificed really anything. I feel like it's only been gain
Yeah.
since I quit drinking anyway.
Well, that's great. That's really good to hear. I think the idea of gain and not giving up is really powerful when it comes to recovery. And the idea that's popping in my head right now, you mentioned that you gave up hangovers, right? Like feeling crappy. I guess I should ask you, do you think that the reward, I guess, quote unquote, reward of drinking, right? Like you get the buzz, you feel good. Do you think the reward of being sober, of feeling healthy and feeling good and having good energy and having healthier relationships, do you think that good outweighs any of the perceived good that you have from drinking?
I mean, for me, it certainly does. I'm not anti-drinking as a general rule.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said before, I do think that it is unhealthy. I mean, it's just an unhealthy substance, and drinking to the point where you have a hangover is really unhealthy for you in all kinds of ways.
Sure.
A hangover is a little mini withdrawal, and if you are getting hangovers too often, I mean, you're kind of on a bad path. But I mean, part of the reason I started drinking was to feel like I fit in with people and to feel comfortable around people socially. And the thing that I was probably most worried about initially when I first started trying to quit a long time back in 2008 was that I wouldn't be able to socialize comfortably, because I'm kind of, I don't like big groups. I'm not,
Sure.
I'm not that social of a person. I'm pretty introverted. And so I thought, this is going to be really, really hard. And it definitely was difficult at first. But the clarity of mind that I have, and the fact that I remember what I said the night before, and the fact that, I mean, I just don't make dumb decisions, and I don't say dumb things, at least that I'm not in control of, is just so far outweighs the kind of easy conviviality that you get when you've had a couple drinks, or in my case, like 9 or 10. So, yeah, again, it doesn't feel like a sacrifice, but I totally understand. Like, if you don't have a quote unquote problem with drinking, I mean, it's an effective way to get to feeling comfortable around people.
Sure.
But I also have come to believe it's a pretty artificial one.
Right. Wow. I also thought it was interesting. You talked about giving up some friends, or maybe you thought they were friends that turned out to be toxic. I think just as a general rule of thumb, that's actually a good rule to follow. Not just in terms of alcoholism or addiction or recovery, where you go through that difficulty and you realize who are your true friends, and those that are not, you can remove them. But I think that's just across the board in life. People that are just toxic in your life, if you don't need them in your life, then you don't need them.
Yeah, I think one thing I keep hearing from people during this quarantine lockdown situation we're in is that they're sort of reassessing how people around them make them feel. I mean, I think we're all reassessing a lot of stuff, right?
Sure.
But what I keep hearing and reading about again and again is people looking at the people in their life and thinking, how does this person make me feel when I'm around them? Do they make me feel good? Do they make me feel bad? Do they make me feel bad about myself? And frankly, I was hanging around a lot of people that made me feel bad about myself. And part of the cure for that for me was drinking so that I wouldn't feel bad about myself or I wouldn't think about it. Um, and I just think it's really important, especially now when we have a little bit of breath and time to think about stuff, or at least, those of us that aren't first responders or emergency workers do. It's just it's important to think about the people around us and whether they make us feel good, whether they add enrichment to our lives, or whether they take energy out of us.
Sure.
Not to sound like too woo-woo, but that is just been such a good practice in my life.
For sure. Absolutely.
I mean, it means you have fewer people around you sometimes, but they're, people who contribute something to you, and you contribute to them instead 100%. Of it being this one-way street.
It reminds me a lot of, I just recorded a recent podcast episode talking about the topic of romantic life and your love life and relationships during quarantine. And I discussed the idea of being in love in terms of your significant other, being in love with their absence or their presence. And what I meant by that is, are you in love with their presence when you're with them? Obviously, like being with them, you're happy and you can actually enjoy your time together. Or are you in love with the idea of their absence, where you're out with friends and you're talking about them, and maybe in your head you have this thought, this idea of what you want them to be. It's like you're projecting something onto them that's not really them. So that kind of reminded me of everything you were talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was first starting to get sober, I went to detox and I got out, and I had a friend who I talk about in the book who I just thought was like my best friend. And I got out and I wanted her to come pick me up, or somebody picked me up, but I wanted her to come stay with me. And I remember she basically and she was a drinking buddy. And I remember she basically kind of rejected that idea by text, and, kind of like a so busy sort of text. And I was like, that's weird. And I kind of filed it away in my mind. And then, fast forward a year or so, and I left the job that we both, worked at, and I never talked to her again. And I think there was just like that break where I sort of realized, so you won't do this like really basic thing for your friend who is saying like, I have this disease that's killing me and I need you to come and like watch over me so I don't drink just for a couple nights. And that was just totally out of the question.
Wow.
And I thought that was normal. And in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't normal. And then I kind of filed it away, and then that person was just vanished from my life. And
wow.
I mean, I haven't talked to them since then. And that's been, more than 10 years now.
Wow. Well, that just shows their true colors pretty quickly, obviously.
And I think it shows that that she's suffering in some way too. I mean, I don't want to be too unkind to this person, right. But because I think people do things for reasons, and I don't think people are with some exceptions, like all sociopathic or all bad. So I'm not saying even that this is like a bad person. It's just they could not be there for me. And I was rejecting that idea and thinking that it was things that were wrong with me, and trying to mold myself in an image that would be more likable to the people I was around. And it just doesn't work.
I think that's such an interesting idea, is that in a situation like that, the most important thing to do is to be empathetic towards them. And what I mean by that is knowing that if they're in a space where they can't even do something basic like be with you for a night or two in times of need, at a time where you need them most, if they're in that space, then you feel sorry for them, right? You feel empathy that they can't even come to terms of being a true friend. So I think that is a really good approach to show empathy more than anything.
I mean, I'm not saying I felt empathy at the time. I'm saying I feel
Not at the
empathy in
time
retrospect
necessarily.
now. I don't think empathy is necessarily possible. Like, you can't expect yourself to. I mean, at the time, like I said, I just thought it was weird, and I called another friend. But if I had thought about it and processed it, I probably would have been mad and thought, that person was being a jerk.
Right.
But in the fullness of time, right? Like, in distance from that person, you can think, oh, that person was probably really suffering too,
Right.
and going through something that I wasn't privy to. And
Sure.
that doesn't mean I have to be friends with them, because a friend should be there for you. But I can also have some empathy in retrospect.
For sure. For sure. I want to talk about the idea of, if you're willing to share moments when you went through relapse, what kept you going? What got you through those moments of difficulty and kind of got you out of that situation and back onto the path of recovery?
Boy, I think that I had a very strong will to live. Um, and I also had, like I said before, I had some knowledge that other people had been able to do it, because there was never a time when I was, after 2008, I would say, which is when I first went into detox and thought I have to quit drinking.
Mm-hmm.
There has never been a time since then that I was like, I really love getting totally drunk. There were lots of times where I had wishful thinking, but I was never like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I could just have a couple? And that's what gets you to relapse a lot of times. But I never had the feeling that, like, this is what I wanted my life to be like. I knew I didn't want my life to be like that. And so partly it was just realizing that it was actually possible to do something different. And partly it was just like, I kept wanting to live. And then partly it was nothing. I mean, when I finally got sober, it wasn't any great, huge revelation or huge rock bottom or something awful happened. And I was like, oh my God, I got to quit, because that happened to me over and over again. I mean, if you talk to enough people who've gone through, recovery, or who are in recovery, I mean, you'll just hear over and over that there's just this moment of clarity where something clicks. And I was just waiting for that moment of clarity, and I didn't know if it was ever going to come. I didn't know if I was going to die, but it did come. And I can't explain why it came when it did, but it just did. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, there wasn't like some great faith in God or something that made me think, or just some great faith in myself, because I certainly didn't have that. It was just kind of going on from day to day and realizing this can't go on forever.
Yeah, it's that will to keep fighting and keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. Before I get into my last question here, I want to have you give you the opportunity to share where people can find you, and to find your book. Where would you like to send people to?
Yeah, people can go to bookshop.org if they want to buy from an indie bookstore. That gives some profits to your local bookstores. You can also, of course, get it on Amazon. And all of my social media is at Erica C. Barnett. So Instagram, Twitter, if you want to find me on Facebook. So I think that's all of the promo things.
Perfect.
Yeah, Facebook, I'm also at Erica C. Barnett Writer if you want to follow my work.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to link all of that up in the show notes.
Awesome.
Cool. So before I let you go here, who do you want to impact the most, whether it be people that are on the same journey that you have been before in terms of addiction and recovery, or maybe it's your entrepreneurial spirit and your career and your you starting a business and that nature. Who do you want to impact the most?
Well, with this book, I mean, what I really want to do is make people realize that I mean, for me, it was relapse, but whatever it is that's holding you back and that is, keeping you from actually doing what you want to do. If you fail, it is not the end of the story. And relapse isn't failure, and failing at one thing doesn't mean you're a failure as a person. So I would say anybody who's struggling with something that seems insurmountable, which addiction certainly seems insurmountable when you're going through it. My book is really about how even if you don't get it right the first time, and even if you screw up a lot, that's not the end of the story.
I love that. That's such a powerful message. I really appreciate you sharing all of that and being vulnerable and allowing yourself to open up and share your message with my audience. So thank you so much for everything, Erica.
Thank you.
Awesome. And like I said, I'll have everything linked up. Be sure to check out her new book, Quitter, A Memoir of Drinking, Relapse, and Recovery, which is released on July 7th. Awesome. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks. You too.